Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP, Ukraine War Frontline update for the 2nd of July 2024. If you don't know what the lines on my map mean, please check out the screen at the moment, pause the video. Right, let's go to the... Oh, I don't have all of my my mappers selected. Let's get Andrew Perpetua's blue lines back on there. You can see there are no changes as according to all the mappers up in the Kharkiv direction, but we all look up there. Just to let you know that this is a 2-day mapping update, really. Much of today, and yes, I didn't do one yesterday, thanks to JR who has done the mapping. Let's go to the Kharkiv direction then. And we'll just pop into Vovchansk first. You can see here that there is supposedly still this area of land that the Ukrainians have surrounded. There are differing accounts as to what's going on here. Deep state map, I think, might have extended a tiny bit. Well, no, probably haven't actually, because I would have seen the pins. But you've got this area of Vovchansk that connects that aggregates plant to the rest of the Russian-controlled zone. Whether it's properly surrounded or not is a bit open to debate. Here we have the RSW saying that they have not observed confirmation of Ukrainian forces encircling Russian forces at the aggregate plant, but ISW's control of terrain assessment in the area indicates that Ukrainian forces, would likely need to only advance roughly 200 meters to completely encircle the plant. The combat situation in Vovchansk is dynamic, however, and it's unclear if Ukrainian forces would currently be able to consistently prevent Russian forces from leaving or reaching positions at the aggregate plant. The Ukrainian encirclement of the aggregate plant would be of limited tactical significance, and it remains unclear how many Russian personnel are present at the plant. So not quite sure whether it is properly surrounded. From what I've heard, it is kind of dynamic. The Russians do try and get some supplies there and personnel, and I would imagine on certain occasions they can, and other times they may be repelled by the Ukrainians who are operating in that area. Not there. No, we don't have any of the mappers give us any information about Kharkiv other than Global War Monitor. So let's start with Kharkiv, and Global War Monitor says here that in the Vovchansk area that the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back in that middle part, but the Russians have consolidated areas of control around here. So he has the Russians controlling all of here, but the Ukrainians pushing the Russians back in this whole area there. So quite different to how these mappers have interpreted things in that sector. And then elsewhere we have in Geopolitics, the Russians have been pushed back in and around that settlement. So we come out of this easternmost of the two salients and come back to the western one. We have the idea that the Russians have been pushed back in this general area, although most mappers, well, not Surat maps, but the other mappers have the Russians pushed back quite a bit in that area anyway. It doesn't look too different to what we have there, to be honest, from, say, Andrew Perpetua. In fact, the other mappers are somewhat more charitable to the Ukrainians there. So that's that northern area. No other news really to mention from there. We come to the northeastern axis from Kupiansk to Svatova to Crimea, and we can see that there are some pins along here. So we've seen not a lot of change here for a good few weeks, other than maybe right at the bottom around the Terny and Torska area. No change there today, but we have some activity ramping up in some of these other places. Near Ivanivka here, which is just to the west of Yahidne, the Russian army advanced from Ivanivka to Stepova Novoselivka, where it took up positions on the outskirts, driving the Ukrainians out of a part of that small settlement. So that's here, Stepova Novoselivka. That is grey zone as according to the other mappers, but as according to Surat maps, the Russians have pushed right to the edge of that village. Right, then we come further to the south, and we come along to the south of Novoselivska, and this area to the west of Kolomirchika, which is sort of on the way to Borova. You've got Borova, supposedly one of the targets. Some thoughts that the Russians might push up here, further to north, and then dogleg down to Borova. This could fit in line with that. So some gains towards Stelmakivka. All the mappers agreeing that the Russians have made some small gains, or some gains towards there, some larger than others. Andrew Perpetua, just a little bit of gain there along this sort of tree line. The other mappers are a little bit more charitable for the Russians there. Indeed, if we go to Suryat maps, we have that. Oh no, it's not that one actually, it's this one. We have the situation on the Luhansk front. During the last 36 hours, the Russian army took a number of positions east of the localities of Stelmakivka and also Makivka further to the south. Although it doesn't have, doesn't have this change in favour of the Ukrainians here, as the mapping has changed on Suryat Maps' map there, that the Russians pushed a little bit out of Andriivka or found not to be there. Maybe a bit of a rejig with some subsequent evidence found. But as we come further down to the south, we see that all three mappers have the Russians moving closer to Makivka in several directions there. One further to the north along a sort of river gorge or sort of small, I don't know what you'd call that. If it's not really a valley, is it? So you've got Makivka here. Is that big enough to be called a valley? Possibly. Very shallow, isn't it? Anyway, they're moving along there as well as along a tree line just to the south there. Let's get back to looking in the right direction. And we can see the Russians gaining somewhat in that area. So a few, I'd say, new places we haven't seen for some time, opening up there for activity, and the Russians pushing in quite a few places there. Then we come down to Chaziv Yar. Remember, this is a 2-day. That's why there are so many pins. This is a 2-day update. Chaziv Yar has some change there, particularly to around the Bodanivka area, which is here. So both north of Bodanivka and south in the trees between Kalinivka and the Canal Microdistrict, as according to Suryat Maps. Let's go there. So they say the situation east of Chaziv Yar. So we'll start with looking north of Bodanivka. So you've got Bodanivka, you've got the tree area there that we'll look at in a second, but we're looking at this part north and even maybe a little further to north. The Russian army intensified its attacks in the Slovyansk direction, advancing towards Hryarivka, where troops seized several fortifications, and towards Orikovo-Vasilivka, where they were repulsed by the Ukrainian army. That is to say, they have made some gains towards Hryarivka, but also they are being repelled in other places as well, maybe a tad to the north of there. I've just changed the direction of the map. So, yeah, Orikovo-Vasilivka up there, trying to attack in that direction too. Also, meanwhile, Russian forces advanced in the forest located between Kalinivka, that's here, and the Canal Microdistrict, which is here, where Russians took control during the last 48 hours over the Church of Saints Boris and Hreb of some high-rise buildings and started combing operations in the ruins of the hydro beton plant. That is to say that they're having success in the forest area here, while possibly making some gains in the north of the Canal Microdistrict and the edge of Kalinivka, but also in some places around here, I would have thought, is what's being mentioned. But there you go. That is Chaziv Yar. It is really tough in Chaziv Yar, I think, for both sides. Really attritional, heavy fighting taking there, and has been obviously for a long time. Slight gain for the Russians going towards Toretsk through Pivichne, moving along that main road going into Pivichne, and this is a real worry for the Ukrainians, as the Russians have capitalized, as mentioned, on some issues there for the Ukrainians, and still seem to be making some gains, at least according to Suryat Maps. But if a change to the Russian control zone, according to Suryat Maps, just north of Novoselivka, another Novoselivka, on the northern part of the Avdiivka salient there, but further back. As we move to the very edge, where that northwestern edge where the Russians are pushing towards the T0504 highway, Suryat Maps has them gaining a little bit in a tree line and a field on the way to Vozdvizhenka, Voshchenka, just northwest of Nova Alexandrivka there. They are just pushing ever onwards as they are further to the south towards this place called Prokhrez, Vovcha, in the Sokil direction. So they've taken control fully of Sokil and they're pushing on northwest there, going past Yevhenivka a little bit, but no doubt they will try and assimilate that area into their control. All three mappers agree that the Russians are making gains in different places around this sector. If we go to Suryat maps, they say that the Russian army made new advances at Yevhenivka, taking control of over positions that are 2.5 kilometers from Pokhrez there, which is a slightly larger settlement. But that's pretty worrying. The Russians still grinding on there all over this Avdiivka sector, really. The very north, further down, in the middle, and on the south as well. Suryat Maps has them taking control over much of... they've just come southwest of Umanska. What's it called again? It doesn't render when it's got too many pins nearby. Anyway, that settlement. Yasno Brodivka, that's it, Yasno Brodivka. So this is, there, it's just popped up. Yasno Brodivka, southwest of Umanska. They have taken control of most of that, moving on that river area. I've talked about this kind of funnel where I was suggesting it would be quite difficult for the Russians to take control over that because the Ukrainians could stop them with the water features and just pummel them as they were there with mortar rounds and artillery, so on and drones, obviously. And that seems to be the case because the Russians haven't ventured so far as to take that. They're trying to creep along the edges of the water features here. The reservoir at Karlivka, just to the south of there, the Russians have moved further into actually the town of Karlivka from through its most easternmost suburbs there or areas. Andrew Perpetua and Suryat Maps having some change in favour of the Russians, and Andrew Perpetua agreeing with the other mappers that quite a large area of land between Karlivka there and further to the south here at Novelska, the Russians now control. So broad agreement with all the mappers. Likewise around Novelska, all the mappers showing the Russians have made some gains there, controlling much of or half of Novelska, but also quite a bit of this land northeast of there. This is fairly well fortified land. There are lots of tree lines and areas where the Ukrainians have been holding out for an awful long time. The Russians are slowly taking that land from the Ukrainians. So quite a lot of Russian activity and gains in the Avdiivka area, but actually no gains, according to these mappers, for either side around Krasnohorivka, Mariinka, Novomykhailivka. There's been some footage coming out from Vuhledar. I showed you that this morning, or at least referenced it, of a number of vehicles and then about 28 motorcycles just destroyed somewhere near Vuhledar. By the Ukrainians. The Russians taking really heavy casualties there, not for the first time in that sector, that's for sure. And Andrew Perpetua has the Ukrainians pushing the Russians back in Robotna there, so that must show that the Ukrainians there probably, I'd imagine, Ukrainians' evidence would be something like Russian artillery hitting here, suggesting that the Ukrainians are there, and thus it's not under the control of the Russians, or it could be drone strikes by the Russians on positions there, which would mean that the Ukrainians would be in those houses. So other than that, no change to Robotna or the rest of the Velika Novosilka area. The Saldo, the Russian in charge of this general area, the Kherson military administration, says that the Ukrainians have been pushed from the left bank, which is kind of what we thought anyway, although it's listed here as grey zone according to Deep State and Andrew Perpetua, possibly because drones are still very active around there, and it's not like the Russians are controlling it with ease. It's more like just a bit of a no-go area. The Russians are trying to take back the islands. At least that's what the ISW has being reported here. Fighting continued on the east bank of Dnipro, including near Krinky, on June 30th. Kherson Oblast Occupation Administration head Vladimir Saldo claimed that Russian forces have driven Ukrainian forces from the east bank and are expanding their zone of control over the islands in the Dnipro River Delta. No confirmation of that, but I would imagine that the Ukrainians wouldn't be fighting on the left bank still. I'm just going to go back. There was a little bit in the ISW that I missed concerning this activity around Toretsk, really. So north of New York, this attack into the Pavichny area. Just there was a little nugget that might be of interest. Russian forces reportedly advanced in the Toretsk direction amid continued ground attacks in the area. On the 30th of June, the Russian MOD claimed that elements of the Russian Veterani Assault Detachment, likely referring to the Veterani Reconnaissance and Assault Brigade, a volunteer assault corps, advanced through an underground tunnel and seized a large Ukrainian stronghold on the eastern outskirts of Pavichny. The Russian MOD claimed that the Veterani detachment advanced through the tunnel under the front line and conducted a surprise attack on a stronghold, forcing Ukrainian forces to surrender and retreat from these positions. ISW has not yet observed visual confirmation of this claim. That would be really frustrating if that's the case, because that's not the first time this has happened. It's happened in the Avdiivka area here, if you remember, around the restaurant that was around here somewhere. I thought it was over here. I think this is that restaurant area, is it not? It's just not anymore. Anyway, that has happened previously. The Ukrainians have suffered from these tunnel attacks a number of times, and frustrating that has happened again and allowed the Russians to gain the initiative and even take some prisoners. That would be really frustrating for the Ukrainians. Anyway, that's enough from me. That's the Frontline update for you. Please like, subscribe and share. Appreciate your support, and I'll be talking to Erland and Daniela from Turchny tonight on a live stream.